Okay, well, thank you very much for such a warm introduction. It's been really incredibly enjoyable being here all week, and it's been very concentrated and very intense, and I think that the discussions have been just as valuable and useful to me as I hope they've been for the people who have participated in them. And actually, because just 5 minutes ago I thought, what a pity that I wasn't able to both give the lecture today and then watch this film afterwards. And actually, I do want to kind of do a little bit of promotion for this film, because it's a film about precarious gender work in the city of Berlin, and nobody has seen it. It's one of those films that it's a fantastic film by a young Berlin filmmaker aged about 38 called Tatjana Tyransky. And I saw it in Berlin, and I was so enthusiastic about it because it so spoke directly to the topics that I'm interested in. And the film narrative is about a young woman architect in Berlin whose jobs begin to run out, and for whom, with the downturn in the economy, there are fewer new buildings going up, and so she finds it harder and harder to get a job, and she drinks more and more, and she also is divorced from her husband, and so in every way the sense of the internalization of anxiety and stress becomes impacted on her body. And at the same time, the film, because she is an architect, the film takes the viewer around the sites of gentrification and change in the city of Berlin. So there's some fantastic scenes where this magnificent city is suddenly producing gated communities and kind of condos of the sort that we've become very used to in London. So the film is actually incredibly self-reflexive. It's also about a critique of gentrification. It's about gender, it's about the family, and it's about neoliberalization, and it's also a marvelous film about the city itself. And I was so enthusiastic about it. I saw it in an audience of about 5 people that I immediately wrote my blog. I wrote a blog. I don't really do blogs very often, but I wrote a blog review of it, and then I was incredibly delighted because the filmmaker herself then picked up the blog and put it on her website. I then got to know the filmmaker, and she became one of the participants in my study of Berlin, which I'll talk about at the end of this paper. And so it was a very nice example of a kind of reflexive research on my part as well, and also a model of research that I've been trying to push in this urban cultural industry research, that in the most recent phase of it that I've been doing, which is the kind of action research. I didn't want to be part of one of the growing kind of urban researchers interested in the creative economy and kind of dipping in and interviewing a few people, and then disappearing again. And so what I've been trying to do, particularly in Berlin, is to develop a mode of research which is much more intensive. And actually, I'm not trained in urban geography. I'm not an economist of urban geography, and I'm not looking at large samples of people. That work is done, and it's done very interestingly, but that's not what I'm doing. So what I've been trying to do, particularly in Berlin, is actually then develop a methodology which narrows down to just 4 or 5 women artists or filmmakers, and which develops a kind of action research for the culture industries, which is reciprocal, so that I embark on a project with them and try and see it through to where it will take us. So in the old-fashioned way that sociological action research used to involve an immersion in a particular kind of project, for example, with young women or with young girls or whatever, kind of thing I did, I don't know how many decades ago. So I've been trying to, and the second distinctive feature of this research that I've been doing in Berlin is that I've also been trying to follow the objects And by that I mean, obviously it's loosely Latourian in one sense, but also I began to feel frustrated by the huge amounts of urban creative research which actually completely weren't concerned with the content of what was being produced, whether it was knitwear or dresses, or whether it was a piece of film, or whether it was an art exhibition. The tendency in urban creative research has been to be absolutely oblivious to the object, apart from the fact that it is cultural and creative. So I tried to develop a methodology that would actually be led by the object and use perhaps some of my own skills of engaging with cultural analysis of music texts or film texts, rather than being completely oblivious to them. So whether or not that will succeed, I don't know, because I haven't finished the book. And I haven't finished the 3 city projects, but that's basically why I would like to do a little bit of promotion for Tatjana's film. And it is available. It can be purchased online apparently, with subtitles. And I think you would find it incredibly enjoyable and good for teaching. So it's a marvelous teaching text. Anyway, okay, this paper today is divided into, I think it's 6 sections, all quite short. And I'll stop for a very brief pause at the end of each section. And what I am doing really is I'm offering an overview and a critical summary and an update of the proliferation of work on urban creative economy, which has really developed in the last 15, 20 years. And I will include some references back to some of my earlier work. And actually, I will focus on. It was interesting what you referred to and to the Mary Quant. But actually, one of the studies that I did, which came out as a book in 1998, and of all the academic work I've done, it's a book that I never ever got invited to. I rarely give any papers from it. But recently, it's had something of a revival, and it's called British Fashion Design, Rag Trade or Image Industry. And I think it fell between many stools. It was published pre the boom in creative economy, and the work was actually done in the early 1990s. And so it wasn't really part of the urban geography. And at the same time, fashion scholars weren't the least bit interested in how fashion designers make a living and how they go bankrupt. And how my recommendations about how they could get together, and what might public policy be for supporting young independent fashion designers. So the fashion scholars at the Fashion Academy were absolutely uninterested in it, apart from a few of the academics who I interviewed for it. So actually I'm really attached to this book, and it took a lot of hard work, because for that book I actually interviewed every single head of fashion department in the UK. I think I managed to get to every single head of department. And I also think it was quite pioneering in that it was very unusual to actually interview academics for this kind of work. And it was quite tricky as well, because there was all kind of questions about confidentiality. But the reason that I did that was because it seemed to me that the existence of what became very well known, established, globally renowned, independent British fashion design was absolutely the product of the art school system. And it was impossible, I argued, to understand the very existence, even of somebody like Stella McCartney or Alexander McQueen, if you did not know what the history of the British art school was, and its long history over 150 or maybe 200 years, and also the battles that had been fought in the art school to establish fashion, and the pioneering women who had to persuade the rather snotty rectors of the Royal College of Art that this was more than just a kind of silly, trivial form of women's embroidery or kind of domestic activity. So I also knew that history hadn't actually been written. There was no single account of it. So for that reason, I absolutely had to go knocking on the doors of heads of department and asking them to be interviewed for that study. So the first 3 chapters really kind of make that argument that the peculiarity and the eccentricity of the art school was actually an incredibly important institutional development, and of course it's one now that is really in jeopardy through the changes to the university system and to the fee system. And indeed, I would argue that the creative economy per se has depended on this art school provision. And I'll just say one more word about that because I think it's really relevant. But the idiosyncrasies of the UK art school system there are 2 important features. One is that these were small art schools and really set up all over the country. You could go to almost any part. You could go to Aberdeen or you could go to Kirkcaldy in Fife and you would find an art school. So it was an incredibly extensive provision. And secondly, built into the history of that provision was the possibility of non-conventional access routes and non-conventional qualifications. So the young people, and that had also long historical, that was the case that existed over a long period of time, that was the possibility of getting into art school without having gone through the standard route for high status, middle class, well-educated young people with their A-levels or their Abitur or their baccalaureate. So it was always the place of people from mixed social, different kinds of backgrounds. And those 2 features together, in many ways, are what have produced everything that came to be associated with the British cultural economy, from, of course, the Beatles or to magazines like the Face magazine or the whole kind of, with a very close relationship, obviously, to youth culture. So that was why I actually felt that British fashion design book, which was interview-based, was something I really wanted to do. And so even though it didn't lead to many invitations, nevertheless, I think it played a little bit of a role. Anyway, I'll come back to some of the findings in a minute. So let me start. Okay, well, section 1. I think almost everybody in this room will by now be familiar with the way in which we have become accustomed to associating urban change and gentrification with the presence of young, cultural, artistic, creative kinds of people. In almost every city in the last 15 or 20 years, there has been a connection made between the appearance, the visibility of young creatives, processes of social change, which policymakers almost always see in very positive terms, in terms of expanding economic possibilities, new forms of growth, and so on and so forth. We've got used to the appearance of new cafes, bars, local delicatessens, and boulangeries, and we immediately know that we are, in for some kind of change in the neighbourhood or district. So this boldly announces the arrival of the arts and the creative economy into the neighbourhood. Academics like myself have become accustomed to reading about the ways in which cities and local authorities have embarked on adventurous, often aggressive marketing campaigns, which are addressed to both potential investors and to tourists. So, for example, one of my young colleagues in Berlin, now at Duke University, who's actually also an expert on crafts, called Doreen Jacobs. Doreen Jacobs gives a vivid account of the development, I don't know if this exists, I'm sure it does in Canada, of art walks in the Wedding district of Berlin, which was the last ungentrified neighbourhood of Berlin, working class neighbourhood. These walks emulate the bus trips into the newly developed creative neighbourhoods in the South Bronx in New York, which Doreen Jacob also analyses. Such activities as these attempt to make overlooked, shabby, or indeed dangerous areas of the city interesting to tourists, while at the same time they deliver customers to the newly established restaurants and gallery spaces. And overall, the idea is to attract the interest of investors and developers who will, it is hoped, embed themselves and create new homes, jobs, and regenerate the area. This entire process has achieved, of course, international prominence as a formula for growth, thanks to the writing of Richard Florida. Florida's seminal text has attracted the attention of readers, including prominent politicians, such as Angela Merkel, across the world. This is because, writing in an accessible manner, as you all know, he moves easily between a diagnostics of post-industrial city dilemmas as to how to innovate and create growth and jobs. At the same time, he develops a prescriptive approach which has the remarkable quality of seemingly being capable of implementation. So there's a kind of can-do feel to Florida, which, you know, we shouldn't completely devalue, absolutely. So Florida creates a series of successful city rankings which depend on the ability of the cities to attract young, well-qualified people who will, by their own enthusiasm, produce a distinctive urban milieu, which will promise renewal and regeneration. You know, the 3 T's, talent, tolerance, technology, and so on. Tolerance referring to the need for a liberal-minded civic culture which is friendly to gays and lesbians, technology, new technology, and talent, of course. Critics of Florida are vocal, as I'm sure you all know. Readers may wish to refer to the most sustained of these being the urban geographer Jamie Peck. And actually, in some ways, I think Florida has been slightly unfairly criticised. He's a kind of sitting duck for old Marxists to have a go at him in a rather macho way, I think. So, you know, I'm not entirely persuaded by the way in which the old Marxists, you know. So, in effect, those of us interested, the outcome of this debate, however, is that those of us interested in the livelihoods of young creative people now find it hard to see their activities as anything other than harmful and complicit if we consider their creative and job creation strategies within the overarching terms of urban development. This is likely to be compounded when we take into account the inflated government rhetoric, which in the UK dates back to the early days of the New Labour government, which from 1997 onwards hoped that creativity would join the financial and service sectors as the post-industrial future for reviving UK competitiveness and growth. Of course, this was before the banking crisis, and the change of government to a coalition led by the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats has actually been noticeably quieter in regard to the creative economy. So it may well be that the boom of creative economy that we associated with the Blair years is actually now over. And the current government has got really nothing like the same degree of interest or faith in the talent-led economy. And likewise, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, which was absolutely prominent during the Blair years, is now a secondary department concerned, it seems, only with the Olympics. So you know, that raises the question, does the banking and economic crisis, the euro crisis, actually signal the decline of the boom in the creative economy? And if that is the case, well then how do sociologists like myself respond? You know, how can we develop a critical engagement? So in what I'm going to say today, I have to say that although sociologists have seen the presence of these young creatives as being harmful or dangerous or middle-class gentrifiers, I have to say my bias of interest has been towards understanding the activities of these young people. So it's these young people who I am sociologically interested in. And what I'll do in the next few moments is offer a series of snapshots or of detailed, quick summary analysis aimed at providing some concepts which I think remain useful for understanding the way in which artists and creative people have been seen as pioneers at the forefront of producing solutions to the shrinking world of work and employment in the post-industrial era. So my interest is precisely what role do these young creatives, graduates from a whole range of arts, humanities, media programs, how can we understand their working practices within the terms of a world of where work is shrinking and in a post-industrial economy? You know, are they pioneers or are they developing survival strategies? So that's the end of section 1, and I'm now going to move on to a little bit more detail in relation to the earlier moment of the new creative economy in the UK. And the concept here that I developed at the time, well, there are two concepts I came up, I used, and I think one of them is still particularly useful, which is urban cottage industries. So the modes of working in the early period of the creative economy that I referred to in British fashion design really could be seen as the development of urban cottage industries. And the other idea that had really fed into this, that came out of the earlier work I did, which was really just very short on second-hand thrift and vintage stores, and was that of subcultural entrepreneurs. So I think in the fashion work I was more interested in the urban cottage industry and dynamic. So from the early 1980s onwards, a time of high youth unemployment, and years before it, the new Labour government of 1997 set about to expand access for young working class people to the universities and the art schools, there came into being the visible appearance of what at the time, and commenting on this phenomena, I labelled subcultural entrepreneurs. So the subcultural entrepreneurs, I argue, developed out of the DIY, post-punk, Thatcherist period also of high unemployment. This mode of self-employment emerged from the long shadow of unemployment and comprised activities such as second-hand clothes markets, fashion design, music production, small record outlets, music events, club promotion, micromedia in the form of flyers, posters, graphic design, magazines, zines, and what we might now call the indie production associated with the do-it-yourself ethos of the punk subculture from the late 70s on. These were all located in rundown city neighbourhoods, indeed in lanes and in out-of-use industrial sites. The sociological significance of these activities was that they showed how youth subcultures were able to generate their own homegrown labour markets, such that, and it was just interesting to me at the time, that I began to see youth cultures as doubling up as informal and unrecognised job creation schemes. So this was, to me, was extremely interesting, that the youth culture, which Birmingham people had kind of looked at for their revolutionary potential or their subversion, were actually functioning as kind of job creation schemes. Albeit existing somewhere within the space of the informal economy, and we can talk more about the informal economy later, and the more legitimate, but as yet unnamed creative economy. These tiny subcultural economies quickly transmogrified into a set of more visible and institutionalized creative practices, including what we might retrospectively see as the flowering of British fashion design from the mid to late 1980s onwards. I'm thinking there of companies which, of course, no longer exist, but very famous, actually, kind of pre-queer theorist performance artists who also produced fashion alongside Vivienne Westwood, such as Body Map. I don't know if that name means anything to you, but if you Google Body Map, you will see exactly the connection between club culture and fashion production and kind of post-punk queer sexuality. Within these few years, cohorts of mostly young women exited the art schools as graduates in fashion design and quickly set up stalls and small outlets in London and also in other big cities. The art schools had opened their doors to more students with non-conventional qualifications, allowing students from working class backgrounds to enter the system of higher education. This trend continued and gathered pace through the 1990s, so that a more socially mixed generation of graduates began to find ways of becoming self-employed, including self-styled fashion designers. Tracking these activities through the 1990s, it became clear that on the longer term, these microeconomies were more or less unsustainable owing to the lack of access to capital and resources to manage exports, high costs of manufacture and production. Too many middlemen, retailers, these were unsustainable microeconomies. So what my study showed was that there was a possibility of 4 or 5 years having a stall, having a small shop, because rents were not so expensive at that time, but on the longer term it proved impossible for these do-it-yourself entrepreneurs to actually become, if you like, full-blown businesses. You know, this was not a business model, it was something else. Nevertheless, their existence was a kind of portent of the future work of freelance or portfolio work in a new creative economy, even though all of them were on the verge of bankruptcy, or did go bankrupt, or were so undercapitalized that they were making their clothes 3 days a week around the kitchen table, which actually was the model that Vivienne Westwood herself was involved in, and then sold them for the rest of the week in shops and stores and outlets. My analysis at the time inverted Ulrich Beck's account of capital without jobs and said that actually these were jobs without capital. And I think that still actually is relevant today. So Beck's capital without jobs could be turned upside down into jobs without capital. So these were activities carried out around the kitchen table and with the help of a single machinist. And often using an intern or a student doing the publicity and the leaflets, and hence the designation of urban cottage industries. These microeconomies of culture were low capital return. So that's what I was interested in. They were really micro, low capital return. So they might become incredibly well known and have their work on the pages of ID magazine or the Face magazine on a monthly basis. But the actual capital return was absolutely minimal. They were barely making a wage, you know, maybe the equivalent of an income of £10,000, £15,000 a year, and working, of course, through the night and so on and so forth. Actually, Hussein Chalayan is a good example of this as well, and his career obviously became more successful, but most of them didn't sustain over the longer term. So these were low capital return activities, generating barely more than a tiny annual income for the designers. Often, in the light of the publicity they received, despite the small earnings, they found themselves vulnerable to bad and unethical practice in the more corporate fashion industry. So they were so naive, so without business training, and so micrological in their cash flows that they were ripe for exploitation. And where my own study made some suggestions to remedy this situation at a policy level, that it seemed obvious to me that it could be something that government could manage, make more productive, make more sustainable by developing collective ethos amongst designers, by developing fashion centres, by bringing in creating jobs for local women in machinists and so on. At the time, this was another bad outcome of my book. At the time, there were a few opportunities to talk with the DCMS, and unfortunately, my proposals fell on deaf ears at the time of the New Labour government. Indeed, I had one meeting with somebody at the DCMS, and along with a few other fashion designers during British Fashion Week. And I made these suggestions about how fashion designers could be sustainable by learning more about production and working more closely with local small-scale production units. And the person one of the minister from the DCMS said, Angela, they have to learn to sink or swim. And that was precisely the moment, actually overlapped completely with the moment of a book that got incredible publicity called Living on Thin Air by Charlie Ledbetter, which also had a blurb from the Prime Minister, from Tony Blair, on the front cover. And Charlie Ledbetter became the kind of spokesperson for the talent-led economy. And his book was published almost at the same time as mine. And so the fact that I was ticked off and told that they should sink or swim was probably completely predictable. As a result of the seeming unviability of small-scale fashion design, the early Blair years saw a decline in specialisation in the context of the difficulties faced by designers. Actually, I think what the outcome was the death of British fashion design, and because it was unsustainable to carry on this creative practice in a way that artists could carry on their own creative practice. And so one saw the disappearance, virtually, of this, what had been a very vital and a very energetic urban form of creativity. This was further intensified with the neoliberalization of the urban environment, which saw rents escalate so that street stalls and markets, never mind shop premises, were no longer affordable. So these little outlets just simply don't exist anymore. Young creative graduates were forced to become more highly mobile, and they were forced also to become individualized multitaskers. So there was a shift away from the specialism of fashion design, which, after all, the government had invested huge amounts of money in their training, but once it became apparent that they weren't business-like, or they couldn't really make it in business terms, they were encouraged to become multitaskers. For example, fashion designers who had been quite well-known household names became shop assistants, in Agnes B, or stylists, or journalists, or fashion forecasters, or bloggers. And I think this gave rise to what I called then the second wave of creative economy. So I saw the first wave as being one of specialism, for example, photography, fashion design, giving way to a second wave. And that second wave is the product of the speeded up neoliberalization of London's cultural economy. So this second wave of multitasking creative graduates also found themselves getting jobs through the grapevine rather than through any kind of normal selective procedures. So with the second wave of multitaskers, we also see at the same time the informalization of labour markets, the bypassing of any kind of normal process of applying for jobs and being selected according to some kind of fair criteria. The requirements of this new, what Whittle has called network sociality, in turn, in the speeded up second wave, involved long hours socialising and always being self-promotional, always being out in bars and clubs, and together these informal structures began to crystallise, producing what I said was new forms of exclusion in the creative economy. Mirroring conventional patterns of social disadvantage. So what had emerged out of a kind of access and egalitarian system of provision, actually, the creative economy came to be a parallel to an old model of elite access, old school tie kind of effect. This gave rise to what we might call creative de-democratization, as legal and institutional processes were bypassed rather than dismantled. In effect, formal job selection procedures no longer mattered. The seemingly exciting work carried out in urban hubs, including bars and cafes, and the encouragement to work in this way, as a result of what Jamie Pett calls the hipsterization strategies of urban governance, consolidated pathways into jobs or projects which, in celebrating informality, at the same time made redundant or simply old-fashioned the procedures developed by leftist and social democratic authorities and employers to protect against nepotism, corruption, and to give equal chances for jobs to people who would otherwise be marginalised and disadvantaged. So that's how I understood the transition to a second wave of creative economy. This shift marks the emergence of a biopolitical effect, the management of specific sectors of the population classified in terms of age and qualification, drawing culture and labour into a close relationship with each other. So culture and labour enter into this close relationship with each other. Events like the Cultural Entrepreneurs Club held in London, with venture capitalists at hand for advice and mentoring, heralded a transition to a full-blown neoliberalisation of the creative sector. This was compounded in the UK by the emphasis on stars, celebrity, artists and designers, and the so-called talent-led economy. certain terms began to disappear entirely from public debate, such as cooperation, sharing. At this time, the word unemployment completely disappeared also. And critique and social engagement on the part of the young creatives themselves became muted, for the reason that, as I argued, the young creators never could know where the next project might come from. So they had to be endlessly upbeat and cheerful and self-promotional. They couldn't afford to criticize anybody or any system or any institution. As a result, bad practice and non-payment for work would simply be put down to the experience. So it became a very depoliticized zone of work. Throughout the first decade of the 21st century, a prevailing ethos of cool wrapped itself around this sector as a self-justifying discourse, replete with an irony, which inured the sector against the need to engage with questions such as self-exploitation, burnout, the possibility of failure, and the downside of competition and individualization. Cool became a mode of self-disciplining and a socially acceptable, indeed highly desirable form of disdainful elitism. By these means, the new creative industries have contributed to a new form of urban hierarchy and to what I have elsewhere referred to as the recalibration of the urban middle class, where the many prevailing discourse referred repeatedly to winners and losers, and where many pages of lifestyle magazines are devoted to the new crop of talent, division, inequality, and disadvantage within this sector are routinely ignored and rarely discussed. Okay, that's the second section. And I think in many ways I have already rehearsed at the very start of this lecture the underpinning, the institutional underpinning and the provision by the state and the access routes into the creative economy. And I think I'll just really sum that up by making 2 points. The currently best paid artist in the world, Damien Hirst, was somebody who got into this system of the art school on the basis of a very, very diminished set of academic qualifications. So Damien Hirst completely, absolutely benefited as a working class boy from this incredibly sustained period of undergraduate education and then postgraduate education in my own college. And is now but he summed up precisely, I would say, the neoliberalisation of the arts world in London during this period as it becomes an urban glamour zone. The other person who also completely benefited from free state education was Tracy Emin, who in effect, through incredible disadvantaged life, which she also of course makes art about, nevertheless, the official facts of her access to the art school was that she had more or less given up going to school from the age of 12 onwards. So as she put it herself, she blagged her way into an actually relatively unknown minor art school in Maidstone in Kent, but was trained by feminists and cultural studies theorists, and on the basis then of producing work which got her first class, got into the Royal College of Art. So I think in many ways that kind of summarises the sections that about creative pedagogy and the universities. And let me move on to a couple of theoretical ways of reading this phenomenon. So I've provided you with the idea of urban cottage industry and with capital without jobs, jobs without capital, and with the role of de-democratization and the decline of politics. Let me look at a couple of theorists who I think might offer a useful way of expanding our understanding of this development. And I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Hart and Negri and with the idea of the mass intellect. And many young scholars have been looking to the post-Marxists, in particular the Italian operaismo school of post-Marxism, which perhaps has the advantage of offering a less pessimistic account. So maybe the value of the Italian Marxists is that they see potential from this expansion of the young creatives, the young precariat. So there has been recent discussion. Indeed, you could say that in contemporary academic discourse, the discussion of precarious work and young creators has been dominated by the vocabulary of the Italian Marxists. So let me just say a few words about whether this work really does provide a theoretical underpinning for understanding. And a good deal of Hart and Negri's work hinges around the notion of the refusal of traditional work. And their optimism hinges on the fact they see, let's say, my young creatives in the UK, they see as being oppositional in that they have refused a class trajectory which would otherwise have been their destiny. So much of the work by Hart and Negri looks at the refusal of work by people in bands or becoming more precarious. That's putting it a little bit crudely. But they also attribute a great deal of importance to the fact that capitalism has made concessions and was forced to change itself in relationship to the threat posed via this refusal of work. So capitalism, if you like, has to retreat and is forced to allow this sector to become more autonomous. And not only does this sector of previously working class young people become more autonomous, but they also grow in rank and they talk to each other more avidly. So they combine, and they combine, according to Hart and Negri, under the term of the general intellect. So that there are all kinds of possibilities, Hart and Negri argue, for repoliticizing work. So that's really what they, for repoliticizing work. Is this optimism something that we can actually attribute to the hipsters of Chicago or the hipsters of Hoxton or Shoreditch? And how can we engage with Hart and Negri in a way that actually does make a more immediately grounded connection that is based on observation of these hipsterization strategies? And I would say, actually, the opposite is the case, that the hipsterization strategies that I've just referred to have required the need for and have resulted in an absolutely neutralizing or depoliticizing stance. That is to say that neoliberalism has been much more aggressively invested in these creative pathways than Hart and Negri allow for. And maybe that's because they're theorists and they haven't looked at actual policies and the implementation of policies. So I'm afraid I don't buy into the absolute optimism of the general intellect. I also think it's a model which is absolutely inattentive to gender and to race and ethnicity. And indeed, in one of the papers that I wrote on this topic, I argued that the new forms of urban hierarchy that appeared, the kind of trendy hipsters of Hoxton, not only were they white and male, but also their career pathways, the endless clubbing, the endless socialising, the endless hanging about in Shoreditch House, actually provided new kinds of blocks for disadvantaged or less advantaged people to access. So that's what I meant about the reappearance of the old school tie within the kind of world of Shoreditch. That is to say, if you were a mum, or certainly if you were a single mum, or if you were not somehow connected into having been at the right school, or been at the right art school, or having the right kind of cultural capital, your opportunities were almost negligible. And a very good example of this is the cleavage in London between the black music scenes associated with disadvantaged black males, the grime music scene, if you like, and the vocabulary of the hipsterization strategies. The two are completely and absolutely separate. And the urban geographers looking at the Shoreditch scene never think about the very underfunded youth club kind of scenes that funded by the state that have produced all kinds of important urban black music. It's totally different. So I think that really sums up my my cynicism about the optimism of Hart and Negri, despite their wonderful theorising. Okay, I'm just going to finish with this section with a couple of words of the theorists that I actually find more useful in terms of offering concepts for developing a strategy for the new culture industries. And here I look to the work actually of Richard Sennett. And I think Richard Sennett offers a much more interesting, even though it's a little bit nostalgic and it's, you know, it's kind of slow and ponderous, and, you know, I'm not sure if I completely agree with his work on craft. Nevertheless, I think what Richard Sennett's group of books on corrosion of character and the other three books, what he really does is that he diminishes the importance of creativity, and he replaces it with the idea of a good job well done. He also engages with difficulty, you know, not with burnout or with having nervous breakdowns or with the kind of very theoretical language that one finds Franco Berardi, you know, talking about the, you know, pain or panic. Instead, Richard Sennett simply talks about the difficulty, and the difficulty of working with materials, and the patience needed to work in the new as well as the old economy. And he also, I think, suggests an idea of a kind of slowness, yes, and a refusal of the speeded up intensity of the new creative economy. So he talks about history, age, narrative, ordinary work, craft, repetition and failure. He talks about the idea of a good job well done, about the joy of slowness, about concentration and the refusal to be speeded up. So let me then say, well, is Sennett in any way relevant to understanding the creative economy today? Can we afford to encourage a kind of slowness or a patience? And my answer to that would be that in making artwork and craftwork ordinary, Sennett has done something very valuable. That is to say, he dislodges artwork and creativity from the exceptional status that it has been expected to inhabit. And he puts craftworking alongside, for example, parenting. And he also then allows us to think of art and creative work as ordinary work. And of course that also he quietly refutes the kind of urban hierarchies and the logic of celebrity culture. Okay, I'm nearly finished. That's the two kind of theoretical models that I have posed against each other. In the last few minutes of this presentation, I'm going to summarise some of the findings of the recent work that I've been doing in three cities, London, Glasgow and Berlin. And this is absolutely not a conventional comparison by any means. Indeed, I've tried to develop a reflexive, qualitative approach to research, which involves a range of different strategies, but it couldn't in any way describe itself as complying with the norms of urban economic geography. And so let me just summarise what I see as being relevant to the creative economy in these three cities. I've already in many ways described what I see as the neoliberalisation of London. And the neoliberalisation of London has meant that the high capital cost of space has costed out younger, less privileged people from the creative industries. So there's a sense in which London has lost the potential that it had in the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s, simply by virtue of buying into high finance capitalism and the world of the city, and becoming, as Saskia Sassen has described, an urban glamour zone. So the urban glamour zone has had the effect of imposing within the world of the arts and culture a hierarchical grid dominated by the same kinds of values that one might find in the film industry and in any other area. So it's, in a sense, it's also dumbed down the significance of the arts and the creative sector, to the point that many of those of us teaching in these areas that have also grown up in master's courses in creative entrepreneurship, master's courses in culture industries, and find ourselves expressing a high degree of ambivalence, yes, because of the financialization of the arts world, and also the way in which the urban glamour zone has also become a place of flow-through. So London becomes a place of flow-through for young creators and also for students. So London becomes a place where, in fact, we could almost say there is a diminishing of creativity. That's one point about London. The second point about London is that the domination of the discourse of, for example, creative entrepreneurship, the cashing in of the culture industries, is at the expense of an equally important aspect of London life, which is its status as a post-colonial city. So the post-colonial life of London is absolutely, completely cut off from this notion of its vibrant creative sector. The two exist in a completely separate realms. And that then reminds me, and perhaps one of the interesting ways of thinking through this polarity. There is a complete polarity between the real London as a post-colonial city, and the Evening Standard London of the urban glamour zone. And in this respect, I would refer to the work of one of my colleagues at Goldsmiths, who also I think works in New York, Abdul Malik Simone. And Abdul Malik Simone looks at mostly cities in the developing world, but through, of course, a colonial and a post-colonial lens. And he talks about the significance of popular economies. And popular economies seems to me to be, again, a useful way, a little bit like Richard Sennett, of moving away from simply the available terms of the art world. So he talks about survival strategies in popular economies in the same way that kids might be doing club nights or charging people on the margins of the black economy. Likewise, in poorer rundown areas of London, such as where my own college is, there are all kinds of small shops which are popular migrant economies. So Abdul Malik Simone, I think, offers a way of looking at the urban creative economy in big capital cities through a more developed and a more rigorous post-colonial lens. And so, to sum up London, this pushes me to think about black artists and black and Asian artists. And the last part of my chapter in London will be very much concerned with people who have, again, achieved a great deal and have come to prominence, but whose backgrounds was facilitated by a more egalitarian regime and not by this new neoliberal world. So I'm thinking about artists such as Isaac Julian, Christoph Feely, the very well-known Steve McQueen, and an artist who I've worked with quite a lot called Yinka Shonibar, who's also become incredibly well known because he did the plinth at Trafalgar Square. They're all of a generation who benefited from social democratic educational provision. Okay, let me say a couple of words about Berlin, and I started off talking about Berlin. I would really be very brief in that Berlin also offers an incredibly interesting showcase for policies of creative economy, partly because the Senate and the federal government have invested quite heavily in making Berlin a place for artists and creatives and techno music, and so there's a sense in which gentrification is happening in a way in Berlin at a rapid rate, at such a rapid rate. Those of you who know the city will be aware that it happens almost on a street-by-street basis. You know, 1 year ago, one street in Neukölln was a Turkish neighbourhood with not much happening in it, and a year later, every second ground floor is a bar that opens at 9 o'clock. And is a bar by, you know, kind of owned and looked after by Spanish young people. And then 2 doors down there's an Italian bar, and everybody's very ironic and say, oh, we don't want Americans here, but, you know, we'll accept Portuguese. You know, there's a kind of very self-conscious language referring to this process of gentrification in Berlin. Really, I just want to say a couple of things about that. One of the profound differences between London and Berlin, given that they're both capital cities and they're both in many ways quite wealthy cities, is that in Berlin there has been a much higher degree of critique of gentrification than in London. So London was gentrified and nobody noticed. Yeah? It was gentrified during the Blair years, and you know, people like myself would, or maybe Paul Gilroy, would have been seen as dinosaurs. You know, just shut up and go back to your, you know, what's happening in Shoreditch or Hoxton is positively good. And there was absolutely no social movement, no opposition, no demonstrations. There was no public coverage. There were no newspaper articles about people being forced to leave where they live and move out to further estates. And actually, the scenario in Berlin is completely the opposite. So that, you know, tells us something interesting, I think, about different political configurations. However, the irony in Berlin comes back, I think, to these hipsterization strategies. And here we see a really, it's not so much sinister, but cynical deployment of the need for hipsterization as a means of earning a small-scale individual living. And so there is a kind of very awkward or uncomfortable inhabiting of this hipster cool scene. And it reflects in many ways the hierarchies that Sarah Thornton wrote about in her famous book Club Cultures. That is to say, what you've got to do to get into this club or bar, what you've got to look like, or what age you've got to be. So there's a kind of self-consciousness to, and I think I'm just looking for, the party scene, exactly. So there is a strong, long-term and deep-rooted subcultural lifestyle revolving around clubs, bars and music. Small shops open and shut across the city on a weekly basis. Sometimes the whole streets become full of little fashion shops set up by the latest crop of design graduates from Berlin fashion colleges. 6 months later, they're all gone. And I sum this up by the idea of the art of making do. So, in a sense, the Berlin economy, and I think this is what makes it interesting, is that there is no alternative. People have got a deep-rooted connection to the city. There are all kinds of modes of belonging and forms of urban citizenship, particularly for women who have got children. And so entrepreneurialism, in this sense, is synonymous with the art of making do, with small-scale livings. And that might be something that we can think about in terms of not the kind of return to growth that the politicians absolutely hope for, but for the basis of livelihoods. And then I'll say, finally, a word about, I'm just going to end up saying a few words about Glasgow, and some of you, again, might know more about Glasgow than I do, but I've been trying to track the cultural economy in Glasgow, and what one finds there is these three models are very interesting, because London is the absolute epitome of neoliberal urban hierarchy, competitive, aggressive and entrepreneurial, summed up by Damien Hirst. Berlin is vibrant and open and critical in its relationship to hipsterization strategies. Actually, what one finds in Glasgow is a strong working class consciousness. And that working class consciousness is terribly interesting because it inhabits art in a much more political way, but in a way that is less open to audiences than other cities. Maybe Chicago, maybe here, I don't know. So there's a very complex relationship to audiences for the reason that in a working class city, art has always had connotations of elitism. And so this produces a kind of psychological troubled psyche in relationship, how to show work, how to sell it, particularly how to sell it, a very strong anti-commercial ethos, and also then a difficulty in thinking through longer-term sustainability, and a terribly kind of complicated relationship to cappuccino culture, to the point that it almost becomes a kind of ritual debunking and a refusal of the challenges by referring to, oh, well, in that area you'll see this kind of people with, you know, their cappuccinos. And the outcome of that, I think, is that often small galleries shut down, and there have been 2 or 3 small commercial galleries run by women shut down. And also the outcome of this, and I hope this doesn't offend any Glaswegians, but it seems to me that the working class politics is voiced in a very macho kind of way. You know, there's a very barbed, very aggressive, very contentious vocabulary across the art scene. And also there is a great deal of disavowing of those who leave, or those who have gone away, or those who have become very, you know, you cannot be successful. It's the complete opposite of London. You cannot be successful without suffering from incredible torrents of anger. And I know that this happens in other scenes, you know, it happens to musicians as well, you know, but it seems to me, and that you can also see this torrent of anger in policy. You know, if you look at policy documents, are full of vitriolic comments about individual persons, and you know, it's really quite surprising. So for that very reason, I actually want to try and tackle it, and I want to try and engage with it. I'm not quite sure how I will, but you know, I think it's better, it's important to actually step back and try to understand these as certain kinds of statements, certain kinds of discursive positions, and to suggest, you know, what is at stake and what is the outcome. And I think actually what is at stake is the anxiety over the future of working class politics, a slight nostalgia for a sense of urban identity, and vitriolic need to define oneself against bad things that happen in London. So, let me then just completely conclude. My conclusion in regards to the debates I've outlined above is that we do see the future of work actually in many of these intermittent, permanently transitional scenarios. So I do think that we see the future of work in these in many respects. The question will be, how can we sustain, how can these forms of practices sustain a life and possibly a family over the years? What will it mean when so many younger people have to accommodate the idea of a livelihood of projects? On the one hand, there is the normalization of creative labour, as the universities and art schools educate these large numbers of enthusiastic young people. For them, there is an expectation that their training will provide them into some kind of pathway for work. No longer do artists do what they once did in the past, that is, try to make it for a few years with exhibitions and shows, and then if this does not bear fruit, retrain or look around for some other job while internalising the disappointment. So we do see the professionalisation of this scene at some level. These high numbers of graduates may well decline a little with changes to higher education, but we cannot be sure. It is possible that they will be sustained, since the paying back of loans will only apply to those with relatively large salaries. So the question in the UK will be, how sustainable is this model of doing a degree in multimedia or in fashion design when you're having to borrow a large amount of money? Still, it does seem to me as though the bubble of the creative industry boom has subsided. The Florida effect has been too roundly criticised to maintain the promotional rhetoric of city marketing, while the so-called hipster ethos also finds itself the subject of more politicised critique from a number of different corners. What we might hope for is a more developed discussion emerging out of what, in art school parlance, is referred to as socially engaged practice. One of the most famous and highly regarded programmes in the Glasgow School of Art is the Environmental Art course. While the overtly political and vocal graduates in Glasgow will decry their use by the local authorities as pseudo-social workers, nevertheless, the possibility of transforming creative industry activity into diverse forms of social work and social enterprise seems to me to be not such a bad thing. It is not unthinkable, despite the grab at this phrase by the Cameron government, that of social enterprise. There needs to be a more theoretically informed debate about what social enterprise could be in the current economic climate, and lessons may be learned from the past and from the times of cooperatives and collectives and workshops within the realm of not-for-profit organisations. There is also a new space for the universities, I would say, that we also have to take on board these issues. So the new space for universities may involve the spaces and the expertise which could be available for this kind of activity. For example, I would like to see the universities providing spaces for showing work and screening films which fail to get any audiences and any distribution because of the Hollywood model of film distribution. In the last year of teaching at Goldsmiths, I've shown 2 films to students, incredibly enthusiastic, neither of which have ever got any hope of being shown in any cinema, even in Shoreditch, I have to say. One of these was a film by Isaac Julian, Looking for Langston. Very important film, early queer, gay, erotic film, also looking at in depth the growth of the Harlem Renaissance and the life of the poet Langston Hughes. And the other film is the film that I put up here by Tatjana Tyranski, Eine flexible Frau, which chronicles the scenes of precarious work in contemporary and rapidly gentrifying Berlin through the eyes of an out-of-work young woman architect who takes to drink as an antidote to her despair in the world of the talent-led economy. Okay, so thank you.